Miss Marple and the Mystery of Poisoned Pages. Chapter 1. In the village of Netherdean, the morning mist clung to the hedgerows like a half-forgotten secret. The sun, a pale coin behind drifting clouds, lit the cobbled paths that wound through ivy-clad cottages and past tidy gardens in full spring bloom. It was the sort of English morning one might paint if one were inclined towards scenes of innocence. But Netherdean, like any village, was not as innocent as it appeared. At the heart of it all stood the Dower House, a fine Georgian structure with grey stone columns, a grand bay window, and an air of genteel decay. It had belonged to the late Colonel Weatherby, a stern figure with military whiskers and a fondness for brandy. But since his passing it had been left to his niece, Miss Euphemia Bindle. A woman of curious tastes and sharper opinions, Euphemia had spent most of her years abroad before returning to Netherdean with a trunk full of books, lace shawls, and quiet disdain for provincial manners. It was she who had arranged the morning's gathering, a literary salon of sorts, in honour of her recently completed memoir, Tales from a Silk Fan. Euphemia had invited a selection of local notables for tea, cake, and readings from her work. The drawing-room was dressed for company, heavy velvet curtains drawn back, lace, doilies under every teacup, and the faint scent of lavender polish lingering in the air. A fire flickered in the grate despite the mildness outside. The guests arrived promptly at 11. There was Reverend Cotterill, amiable and absent-minded, forever forgetting his umbrella. Beside him sat his sister, Miss Edna Cotterill, severe and starch-collared, her lips permanently pressed in disapproval. Mrs. Gillibrooke, the baker's cheerful widow, settled near the window, while young Mr. Basil Frame, a schoolteacher with socialist leanings and a growing disdain for Euphemia's memoir, pretended to be fascinated by the bust of Homer in the corner. Miss Hartley, a nervous spinster with a fondness for cats and crossword puzzles, perched on the edge of her seat like a bird waiting to flee. And then, of course, there was Miss Marple. She had accepted the invitation with quiet interest and a faint smile. Euphemia Bindle's return had already set village tongues wagging, and Miss Marple, who had long observed that the most intriguing chapters of life were written in whispers and silences, was curious. She sat near the hearth, her knitting needles stilled in her lap, her expression mild and faintly amused. Euphemia entered dramatically, her gown a rich plum, her silver hair piled high, and her eyes sharp beneath pencilled brows. She held a copy of her memoir in one hand and a thin ivory paper knife in the other. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began with theatrical flair, "what a pleasure to gather among such learned minds. Today I share with you a chapter most dear to my heart, the Mandarin's Prophecy." Polite applause followed. Basil Frame stifled a yawn. Euphemia read aloud with dramatic inflection, her voice lingering on certain syllables as if savouring their importance. The story of love and betrayal in Shanghai drifted through the room, drawing nods from some, eye-rolls from others. Miss Marple, seemingly inattentive, examined a small crack in the base of the fireplace. Her ears, however, missed nothing. As the reading ended, teacups were refilled. Conversation blossomed, polite, brittle, occasionally barbed. "I suppose you witnessed all these events personally?" asked Basil with a pointed smile. Euphemia narrowed her eyes. I did not say so, but one absorbs a great deal when one listens. Miss Marple's smile twitched. Indeed, she thought. Shortly after noon, Euphemia excused herself, claiming a headache. I'll fetch my medicine and lie down for a spell. Please, stay and enjoy the tea. She swept from the room, her silk slippers whispering across the floor. 10 minutes passed, then 15. At first, no one noticed the time. Mrs. Gillibrooke commented on the lemon cake. The Reverend debated the merits of Chinese literature. Basil grumbled something about imperial nostalgia. But when Miss Hartley, fidgeting nervously, offered to check on their hostess, she returned pale and shaking. She's not waking, she whispered. Oh dear, I think she's gone. In the chaos that followed, clattering footsteps, gasps, the Reverend rushing upstairs with his collar askew, it was Miss Marple who remained seated, her knitting untouched. She had noticed something, a smear on the edge of Euphemia's teacup, the faint scent of bitter almonds clinging in the air, just under the lemon and lavender. And before the others had even gathered their wits, she knew. This was not a fainting spell, nor a tragic collapse from age. This was murder, and it had been planned carefully. Chapter 2. By late afternoon, word had swept through Netherdean like a sudden chill wind across an open field. Euphemia Bindle was dead. The dower house, once host to idle gossip and tepid tea, now held the uneasy hush of tragedy. Police had arrived in short order, summoned by Miss Hartley's trembling hands, and Reverend Cotterell's breathless dash to the telephone exchange. A young constable named Druitt stood stiffly on the doorstep, his notebook clutched like a shield. Inside, Inspector Cray had begun his quiet, methodical questioning. The guests remained in the drawing-room, no longer talking over cake and manuscripts, but whispering behind cups that had gone cold. I told her that brand of laudanum was too strong, Miss Hartley murmured, wringing her handkerchief. But she wouldn't hear of changing. Always said the bitterer the better. It wasn't the laudanum, Basil said a little too quickly. Mrs. Gillibrooke clutched her handbag tighter. Now, young man, let the inspector do his work. He stood by the window, staring out at the garden where the crocuses bloomed obliviously. I'm only saying, she didn't look ill, did she? Not enough to die in 10 minutes flat. That's quite enough, Edna Cotterell snapped, her face drawn tighter than her bun. But the room had heard the suggestion, and it hung there, sour and heavy. Miss Marple, who had said very little since the moment Miss Hartley returned, now leaned slightly forward. Her expression remained mild, her voice light. People rarely look as ill as they are, she said softly, and sometimes they look rather worse than they truly feel. Human nature, you know. We all wear little disguises. Inspector Cray entered the room then, tall, grey-moustached, with a tired sort of dignity. He glanced at each of them in turn, before addressing the group. I'm sorry to disturb you again, he said. I know this has been a shock. Miss Bindle was found on the chaise in her private sitting-room. No sign of struggle, no injury. Her medicine vial, laudanum, I believe, was beside her. We'll be sending for an autopsy. Miss Hartley's face crumpled. I knew it. Her heart. We'll know soon enough, Cray said, not unkindly. But I must ask, did any of you see her prepare her tea before she left the room? Ichem, silence, No, said Basil finally. She poured herself a cup during the reading, but it was untouched. She had another upstairs, Miss Hartley said. She always kept a tray in her private room, one of those silver ones with a handle. I saw it when I fetched her shawl last week. Cray scribbled a note. Did anyone follow her when she went to lie down? No, said Edna. She excused herself and left. We assumed she needed rest. She said she had a headache, muttered Basil, but she seemed fine just moments earlier. Cray's brow furrowed. Anyone else come or go during that time? No one, Mrs. Gillibrooke replied firmly. We were all still here, listening to Basil make faces. The inspector gave a faint sigh. Well, no one is to leave the village, for the time being. We'll be in touch as needed. For now, I'd suggest returning home. Constable Druitt will escort you. There was a shuffling of coats and quiet footsteps. Miss Hartley was escorted out by Reverend Cotterell, who murmured apologies for the indignity of suspicion. Mrs. Gillibrooke offered Edna Cotterell a lift in her motor car. Miss Marple lingered at the doorway. Cray turned to her. You've been very quiet, Miss Marple, she smiled. One often hears more by listening than speaking, Inspector. You saw nothing unusual? I saw a room full of people trying not to offend a woman they disliked, she replied with delicate frankness, which is rather more revealing than it sounds. He gave a thin smile. Do you believe it was natural causes? Miss Marple tilted her head. I have found over the years that people rarely die without leaving a footprint behind, even if that footprint is only the absence of one. And with that, she stepped out into the fading afternoon light, the village of Nether. Dean responded to Euphemia Bindle's death in a manner both predictable and revealing. The vicar's sermon the following morning was amended to include a solemn note on the suddenness of life's departure. At the greengrocer's, Miss Blodgett whispered that Euphemia had looked ghostly for weeks. At the post office, Mr. Sims remembered her once speaking harshly to a delivery boy over a misplaced crate of manuscripts. The village gossip swirled like leaves in a storm, each person sure they had always suspected something. At the centre of this social cyclone sat Miss Marple sipping tea in her front parlour. She had made no declarations, no dramatic assertions. But her mind was busy, cataloguing contradictions, weighing silences, and remembering in particular the peculiar angle of Euphemia's teacup and the untouched slice of sponge cake beside it. By mid-afternoon, a visitor arrived. Basil Frame stood awkwardly on her doorstep, hat in hand. I hope I'm not disturbing you, he said. Not at all, said Miss Marple, ushering him in. Tea? No, thank you. He perched on the edge of her floral settee. I thought you should know. Euphemia and I had a row last week. About the memoir. Did you? I told her it was libel. Or close to it. She changed names, but not well enough. Everyone knows who she was writing about. The chapter she read, aloud, the Mandarin's prophecy that was about my uncle, Captain Geoffrey Frame. Miss Marple's eyes rested gently on him. Your uncle who vanished during the Boxer Rebellion, yes? He blinked. How do you... I recall the incident. I read about it in the Times many years ago. Skill insinuated he betrayed his unit, that he sold secrets to save his own skin. That's a lie. He died trying to get his men out of that compound. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then, you must have been very upset. I was furious, I told her she had no right to print it. She just smiled and said, 'Truth has no regard for comfort.' And yet she invited you to the reading. She enjoyed provoking people," he muttered. "She said being uncomfortable meant we were paying attention." Miss Marple nodded, slowly. "And yet," she said softly, "she left the room rather too early for someone who was enjoying herself." Basil looked up. "What do you mean?" But Miss Marple merely offered a gentle smile. "I'm sure we shall learn in time." Chapter 3. 2 days after the death of Euphemia Bindle, Netherdean had returned to its usual rhythms. On the surface, the baker's bell rang at 7. The milk cart clattered down the lane, and children in pressed uniforms marched dutifully towards the schoolhouse. But beneath that familiar order, something had shifted. There was a sharpness in the air, questions unspoken, glances exchanged, and pauses that hung just a moment too long. Miss Marple, ever precise in her habits, took her morning walk around the green. Her cane tapped softly against the cobbles, but her thoughts were anything but idle. It wasn't only Euphemia's death that preoccupied her. It was the manner in which the village had responded. Too quickly, too neatly. Euphemia had not been beloved, that much was clear. But neither had she been entirely despised. The emotion swirling in the village now wasn't grief. It was something more complicated. She passed the greengrocer's and gave a polite nod to Mr. Sims, who pretended not to be watching her from behind a stack of turnips. She paused by the post-box and adjusted her gloves. Then, as if on cue, the door to the vicarage opened. Reverend Cotterell stepped out, his face weary but kindly. "Ah, Miss Marple, out for your constitutional." "Indeed. And you, Reverend, how are you bearing up? It's not every week a sermon must contend with murder." He offered a rueful smile. "It does stretch the scriptures, I admit, though I've found the Psalms more useful than Corinthians in times like these." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Tell me, did Miss Bindle attend services often?" The vicar hesitated. "Infrequently. When she did come, it was usually to correct my Latin or suggest I read from the Apocrypha. She had strong views on liturgy." "Did she make enemies because of those views?" He cleared his throat. "Miss Bindle preferred confrontation to compromise, a quality that tends to collect resentments, I find," Miss Marple said gently. "Did she confide in you at all? You must hear many things, being both reverend and counsellor." "She spoke often," he said carefully, "but confiding, no, I wouldn't say so, though she did ask me something curious just last week." "Oh?" "She inquired whether libel in a memoir could result in legal charges if the person in question was deceased. I told her I didn't think so, though morally I imagine it's a graver matter." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Thank you, Reverend. That may explain a great deal." As she turned to go, he called after her. "Do you think it was poison, then?" She paused. "I think," she said, "that when a woman with many opinions and many enemies dies suddenly, one ought not to assume coincidence." That afternoon, Miss Marple made a visit to the library. The Netherdean Lending Library occupied 2 cramped rooms at the back of the town hall, presided over by Miss Pamela Drury, a soft-spoken woman in her 40s, with hair perpetually coming, loose, and a passion for organising things no one asked her to organise. Miss Drury looked up from her ledger. "Miss Marple, how very good to see you." "And you, Pamela, I was hoping to ask a small favour." "Of course, anything." Do you recall if Miss Bindle had requested any books in the past fortnight, or perhaps left any behind?" Pamela's face scrunched in thought. "Let me see. Yes, she returned a volume on Chinese dynastic history, and she borrowed The Golden Dagger by Miss Wren. Rather gory stuff, if you ask me. Oh, and a French dictionary. She was translating something, she said. A curious mix. She always was particular, and quite cross when a book was overdue." Miss Marple smiled. "Did she speak to anyone here last week?" Pamela hesitated. "Well, Mr. Pilbeam came in on Wednesday. They had a bit of a row, actually. Quiet voices, but you could tell from the looks." "Mr. Pilbeam? The solicitor?" Pamela nodded. "He handles most of the local estates. They stepped outside after a few minutes, but I noticed she dropped a page from her handbag. Looked like part of a letter. She picked it up so quickly I didn't see much. Did she seem angry? She seemed triumphant, I think, as though she'd won something." Miss Marple's next stop was Pilbeam & Co., a modest stone building tucked behind the milliners. Mr. Harold Pilbeam was a sleek man with careful shoes and a polished manner. He greeted her with a cordial bow. "Miss Marple, what a surprise! Do hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Never for you. Please, do sit." She settled herself in the worn leather chair across from his desk. "I was rather hoping you could help me with a small matter. I'll do my best. It concerns Miss Bindle." He blinked. "Ah, you saw her recently?" "Yes, last week. She came regarding a codicil to her will." "Really? How intriguing." She was insistent that a new clause be added immediately. It was to take effect upon publication of her memoir. "What sort of clause?" He adjusted his cuffs. "She wished to leave a small sum to a person she refused to name directly. She called them the uncredited truth, which I assumed was metaphorical." "Poetic, certainly," Miss Marple murmured. She left a sealed envelope, to be opened only if the memoir caused scandal or legal action. Of course, now that she's passed, it may yet prove relevant. He frowned slightly. She always liked to play games. She also understood people very well, Miss Marple said softly. She knew how tightly they guard secrets, and how easily those secrets unravel. That evening, as dusk softened the edges of Netherdean's neat rose and trimmed hedges, Miss Marple sat by her fireplace with her embroidery untouched. So far, the facts were few. A memoir, a teacup, a sealed envelope, a schoolteacher with a personal grievance, a solicitor hiding behind professionalism, and above all, a woman who died at precisely the moment her words might have changed everything. But one fact rose above the rest. Someone had wanted Euphemia Bindle silenced, and someone else, perhaps even the same someone, had helped her write the ending. Chapter 4. The coroner's report arrived the next morning and confirmed what many had begun to whisper. Euphemia Bindle had been poisoned. The agent was identified as digitalis, an extract derived from foxglove, easily fatal in concentrated form and often mistaken for natural heart failure, if not tested for. Constable Druitt, unaccustomed to cases involving poisonings and literary feuds, appeared visibly unnerved as he pinned the notice to the board inside the village hall. By midday, the news had reached every kitchen and shopfront in Netherdean. The village, always a place of careful courtesies, turned inward. Doors closed more quickly. Conversations grew shorter. Everyone had a theory, and nearly everyone had a suspicion. Inspector Cray returned to the Dower House, now sealed off and watched by an officer in a damp mackintosh. He summoned the surviving members of Euphemia's gathering to the vicarage for further questioning. The drawing room, with its ecclesiastical paintings and faint scent of beeswax, played host to some very unholy considerations. "I'm sure this is all a terrible misunderstanding," Edna Cotterill declared the moment she sat down, her handbag clutched like armour. The laudanum must have reacted badly with something. Euphemia was always experimenting with Eastern herbs and tinctures. She never trusted English doctors. Inspector Cray, seated with his notebook open, glanced up without humour. "It was digitalis, Miss Cotterill, not laudanum." A flicker passed over her eyes. "Well, I wouldn't know about such things." "Did you have any cause to dislike Miss Bindle?" Edna sniffed. "She was unpleasant, certainly, but I dislike many people. I don't go poisoning them." "She accused you in her memoir of being a sanctimonious relic with a talent for sabotage." "She wrote that?" Edna turned to her brother, scandalized. "Reverend!" "I'm sure she meant it. Playfully?" Reverend Cotterill said, though he looked like he regretted ever inviting her back to the village. Inspector Cray turned to Basil Frame next. "You argued with her over a chapter." Basil didn't deny it. "Yes, and I told her it was a disgrace to print such accusations. But I hardly think that's cause for murder. You also had the opportunity. You lingered in the drawing-room after she left. So did half the room." Basil snapped, "and I wasn't the only one with reason to despise her." Cray's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Basil hesitated, then exhaled. "She knew things. She had a habit of digging into people's pasts, pulling on old threads. Miss Hartley, for instance, Euphemia hinted at something in the reading about a companion in Hong Kong. A lost inheritance, wasn't it?" All eyes turned to Miss Hartley, who sat with her gloved hands neatly folded, lips pale. "I won't dignify such insinuations," she said quietly. "I've never been to Hong Kong." "But you were once engaged to a naval officer stationed there, were you not?" Basil asked, a touch too eagerly. "Commander Wells?" Miss Hartley flinched just slightly. "That has no bearing on this matter." Inspector Cray made a note. "And what of Mrs. Gillybrook?" Cray continued, turning a page. "Miss Bindle described you in an early draft as a woman who needs both dough and the truth with equal liberties. Rather pointed, wouldn't you say?" Mrs. Gillybrook's normally cheerful demeanour faltered. "I asked her to remove that chapter. She said she would. But you didn't confirm it. I took her word." Her voice was clipped, which clearly was a mistake. Cray leaned back. So far, every person in this room had reason to see Miss Bindle silenced, and yet no one admits to seeing anything suspicious. No one recalls who poured her tea upstairs. No one remembers what happened in the few minutes she left the salon. Miss Marple sat quietly beside the fireplace, hands folded in her lap. She had said nothing for nearly the whole exchange. But now, with a soft clearing of her throat, she spoke. "There's something very particular about poison," she said, gently. "It requires preparation, knowledge, and nerve. One must not only dose the victim, but ensure it's neither too much nor too little. A misstep, and suspicion arises. The room stilled, and yet, she continued, someone here did just that, at just the right moment, with just the right calm. Inspector Cray gave her a long look. "Are you suggesting a woman, Miss Marple?" "I suggest nothing," she said mildly, "but I do observe." Her gaze drifted to the window, where the clouds hung low and the hedge rustled faintly in the wind. That evening, Inspector Cray visited the apothecary. Mr. Lenwood, a man who resembled a bottle himself, thin, glassy-eyed, and perpetually dusted with chalk, was surprised to see him. "Digitalis," he repeated. "Yes, we carry it, in small tinctures, prescription only, of course." "Any sold recently?" Lenwood consulted a ledger with narrow, spidery writing. "Let's see. One request. 3 weeks ago, Miss Bindle herself, she asked for a refill. Had a note from Dr. Merton." Cray frowned. "That note still on file?" "No, she took it with her. Said she wanted to compare dosages with a book she was writing." Cray made a low noise of frustration. "Did anyone else inquire about Digitalis?" "No, but, well, yes. A week ago, a visitor asked questions about its properties. Didn't buy anything, but seemed very interested in how one might mask its taste, especially in Hu liquid." Cray's eyes narrowed. "Who?" "Didn't give a name, but I remember the hands, pale, soft. Someone not accustomed to gardening or cooking. No ink stains, either." He paused. But there was a ring, thin gold band, worn on a chain around the neck, not on the hand. Miss Marple sat in her parlour later that evening, reviewing the facts as she stitched a hem. She had not interrupted the inspector's efforts. Let him pursue his list of suspects. Let the village talk itself breathless. Truth did not need to shout. Someone had stood in that drawing-room and heard a passage from Euphemia's memoir that cut too deep. Someone had planned for this moment, measured it out like a dose of poison, and someone was hiding in plain sight. Chapter 5. 3 days after Euphemia Bindle's death, the village of Netherdean settled into a strange kind of rhythm, one in which suspicion had become part of the daily routine. Tea was poured with wary glances. Conversations dipped into whispers the moment someone entered a room. It was no longer just a mystery. It was personal. Miss Marple spent that particular morning in her sitting room, her lace curtains drawn back just enough to watch the street without appearing to watch it. She had just finished mending a cuff when a quiet knock rattled the front door. It was Miss Pamela Drury, the librarian, her hat slightly askew, and her eyes more anxious than usual. "I do hope I'm not intruding," she said. "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "Do come in." Pamela settled onto the edge of the armchair and twisted her gloves nervously. "It's probably nothing, but I found something odd in one of the books Euphemia returned." Miss Marple set aside her needlework. "Go on." It was the Golden Dagger, the murder mystery she borrowed the week before she died. She returned it early, said she didn't like the writing, but I only got around to shelving it this morning and, well. She reached into her handbag and produced a folded slip of paper, yellowed, brittle, and faintly smudged with what looked like lemon cake crumbs. Miss Marple took it delicately and unfolded it, It was a torn page, handwritten in a hurried scrawl. The ink was faded but legible. And if she dares publish it, she'll regret it. I know what happened in Peking. You think I don't, but I was there, and I still have the letter. You'll stay quiet, or it comes out. See, Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her fingers paused a beat longer on the edge. You found this tucked into the book? Yes, pressed between the last pages, almost like a bookmark. Had it been there long? Pamela hesitated. Hard to say, but the binding's a little cracked. Someone used it more than once. Miss Marple looked again at the handwriting, rushed angry, and yet the line about Peking, another reference to Euphemia's tales from her time abroad. She had clearly stirred something old and buried. And this was the golden dagger, yes? Pamela nodded. A story about a man who stages a suicide to frame his rival, if I remember correctly. Miss Marple mused, all over a woman's affections and a concealed letter. Pamela blinked. I hadn't made that connection. No one usually does, she said gently. Thank you, my dear. This is most helpful. Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the Dower House later that afternoon. The property remained under police supervision, but Constable Druitt, now somewhat flustered by Miss Marple's gentle familiarity, allowed her a supervised look inside Euphemia's private sitting room. The space smelled faintly of dried lavender and furniture polish. The chaise where Euphemia had untouched, a faded cushion still bearing the impression of her last hour. Miss Marple's attention, however, drifted to the writing desk by the window. It was neat, almost overly so, paper stacked with corners aligned, an inkwell capped, a quill freshly trimmed. But what caught her eye was a small detail, something no one had remarked upon in previous reports. A copy of Tales from a Silk Fan lay beside the inkwell. Miss Marple opened the book carefully. On the flyleaf, Euphemia had written in her sharp, looping hand, "For the truth is rarely kind, but always inevitable. E.B." She turned a few more pages and paused at the chapter titled The Mandarin's Prophecy. There, faint but visible, in the margin, someone had underlined a sentence in pencil. He disappeared into the night with the secret sealed in ink and regret. Below it a single letter was scribbled in shaky hand. See, Miss Marple stared at the marking. Not the author's doing. Someone else had handled this copy. Someone who'd read this line, reacted, and left their trace. A mistake. A small one. But poisoners, in her experience, often made small mistakes when they believed the crime had gone unnoticed. She flipped the book closed and examined the spine. A sliver of fine thread poked out near the back cover. A page had once been bookmarked. There. Carefully she retrieved the loose thread and tucked it into her handkerchief. That evening, Inspector Cray arrived unannounced at Miss Marple's cottage. He looked tired, his coat dusted with wind-blown pollen, his expression pinched. "I've spoken with Commander Wells," he said without preamble. Miss Marple, pouring tea, raised her eyebrows. How enterprising. "He confirms he was engaged to Miss Hartley years ago. Said it ended unpleasantly. Unpleasantness, I find, is rarely confined to one party." Cray sat stiffly. "He also said Euphemia wrote to him last month, asked about a letter he sent in 1901. She believed Miss Hartley had intercepted it and concealed its contents. He never received a reply." Miss Marple set the teapot down gently. And yet Miss Hartley insisted she'd never been to Hong Kong. A curious thing to lie about. Cray rubbed his temples. If we could find that letter. Perhaps we already have, Miss Marple said, rising. She fetched the torn page Pamela had given her and handed it over. He read it twice, his eyes narrowing. This is damning, but not complete. The signature C, that narrows the field. Cray looked up. Cotterill? She offered no confirmation. Only, I should like to speak with the Reverend, if I may. Alone. Cray hesitated, then nodded. He's at the church. Take Druitt with you. I think, she said gently, he would be more forthcoming without uniformed company. You see, I believe he's not the killer, but he may know who is. The church was nearly empty when Miss Marple arrived. The soft creak of pews echoed faintly as Reverend Cotterill emerged from the vestry, surprised but not displeased. Miss Marple? At this hour? She stepped forward slowly. I wanted to speak to you about Euphemia, and about a letter from Commander Wells. His expression changed. She continued. I believe you found the letter years ago. I believe Miss Hartley entrusted it to you, or perhaps asked you to destroy it. The vicar sat heavily. I didn't destroy it, I couldn't. I told her I would, but I kept it. It was unkind, but not criminal. Euphemia found out about it somehow. She wanted to print it. She threatened to, yes. Said it belonged to the historical record. I asked her to reconsider. Miss Marple watched him carefully. Did you write a note? A warning? He hesitated, then shook his head. No, I confronted her directly. She laughed, said I should take up fiction writing. But someone else left that note. The vicar looked up sharply. Someone else? Miss Marple stood. Yes, and now, I think, we know who. Chapter 6. By the following day, the case had begun to shed its tidy outlines. What had initially seemed a sudden death, with a dozen plausible motives, was now revealing the brittle, fraying threads of something deeper. Older wounds, secrets long buried, and resentments that predated Euphemia Bindle's memoir by decades. Marple, never one for dramatics, nonetheless moved through the village with a deliberate focus. She had spent the early morning rereading select passages from Tales from a Silk Fan, not for literary merit, but for what Euphemia had chosen to emphasize, and, more importantly, what she had conspicuously left unsaid. By midday, she made her way to the Cotterill residence. Edna Cotterill opened the door with a sharpness that suggested she'd been expecting someone, and hoping it wouldn't be Miss Marple. Miss Marple, how quaint. Good afternoon, Edna. I thought I might borrow your opinion on a rather delicate passage. Edna gave her a suspicious look but stepped aside. Inside, the air was stiff with polish and disapproval. Doilies lay on every flat surface. The fireplace was unlit despite the chill. Miss Marple retrieved the marked copy of Tales from a Silk Fan from her handbag and opened to a familiar page. She writes here, Miss Marple said, of a woman who hid behind moral superiority while privately silencing others' truths. Euphemia claimed this character once burned a letter out of duty to propriety. You wouldn't happen to know who she meant? Edna's nostrils flared. I can't imagine why that would interest you. Because, Miss Marple said gently, "I believe the letter in question never was burned, and that its discovery may have led to Euphemia's death." Edna crossed her arms. "If you're implying that I—" "Not at all," Miss Marple interrupted smoothly. "But someone believed Euphemia had possession of that letter, and someone went to great lengths to ensure it wouldn't come to light." Edna hesitated. "Do you know who C might be?" Edna looked away toward the curtained window. "Clara Winton," she said at last. "Pardon?" "C.W. She and Euphemia were close, once, before the war. There was an incident, something about a trust fund. Euphemia hinted at it more than once. Clara married badly. There were rumours. Is Clara still alive? Passed 5 years ago, but her daughter still visits occasionally. Evelyn lives in Brighton, I believe." Miss Marple made a thoughtful sound. "You think Evelyn might have known about the letter?" Edna pressed her lips into a line. "I think she had every reason to despise Euphemia. Clara died penniless. Euphemia profited on her stories." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Pamela Drury at the library again, where she was greeted by the sight of Pamela attempting to recategorize the non-fiction section for the 3rd time that month. "Miss Drury," she said, "I wonder if you could help me find any correspondence between Euphemia Bindle and a Miss Evelyn Winton." Pamela blinked behind her spectacles. "Oh, well, we did receive a donation box of letters and clippings from Miss Bindle's estate a few weeks ago. I hadn't sorted it yet. Would you mind if I had a look?" "Not at all. It's in the back." Together they sifted through a battered cardboard box that smelled faintly of mothballs and India ink. Most of the contents were mundane: receipts, travel notes, clippings from literary journals. But nestled between 2 stiff envelopes was a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Miss Marple unknotted the ribbon delicately and began to read. The letters were from Evelyn, dated between 1929 and 1931. They were personal, even warm at first, discussions of travel, society, Euphemia's manuscripts. But then the tone shifted. "You said you would never publish that story. You promised Euphemia. My mother's dignity should not be a footnote in your memoir. Another, I warned you. If you insist on including the letter from Commander Wells, there will be consequences. I'll not allow my mother's shame to be paraded for your gain." And finally, a torn fragment. "You always said truth mattered most, but some truths rot. The soul, Euphemia, leave the past buried." Miss Marple exhaled slowly. So Evelyn had known of the letter, and she had feared its publication enough to threaten Euphemia outright. But Evelyn Winton had not been at the salon, which meant someone else had acted for themselves or on her behalf. That evening, Inspector Cray paid a visit to Mrs. Gillybrook. The widow met him at the door with her usual smile, though it was thinner now, more rehearsed. "I heard you've been asking questions about Evelyn Winton," she said before he could speak. "Odd that." Cray raised a brow. "You knew her?" "She used to summer here years ago. Stayed with the Bindles before things went sour. Always did seem tightly wound. Not unlike Euphemia, come to think of it." "You've read the memoir?" "Only the excerpt she read aloud. I didn't care for it." "She wrote about you in it." Mrs. Gillybrook's smile vanished. "Did she? She called you a woman who learned early to smile through locked doors." The widow turned away. She knew nothing about my life. And yet you were close once, weren't you? I baked her birthday cakes for 5 years running. That's as close as we got." Cray studied her. "Did you speak to her privately the day of the reading?" "No. I tried to avoid her after the chapter. I knew she'd be smug about it. And yet somehow her cup of tea upstairs was poured, stirred, and left waiting. I told you, I never went upstairs, but someone did." She said nothing. After a long moment, Cray nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Gillibrooke. That will be all for now." Back in her cottage, Miss Marple reviewed the fragments now forming the shape of a motive. A stolen letter. A memoir threatening to expose old betrayals. A note signed with a single letter, C, which might not refer to a name at all, but a shared secret. And then there was the underlined line in Euphemia's book. "He disappeared into the night with the secret sealed in ink and regret." A metaphor, certainly, but also a message. Miss Marple glanced at her knitting, untouched on the side table. The pattern was simple, a repetitive cable stitch. She had always liked how the same strand could twist both ways, depending on where it crossed. Truth, she thought, was no different, and the final twist was still to come. Chapter 7. It was just past 9 the following morning when the second shock struck Netherdean. A constable had been dispatched to the library with a routine request. "Inspector, Cray wanted to examine a few more of Euphemia Bindle's returned books." But when the door was opened by the miller's boy delivering bread, the library was empty. Not just empty, in fact, but cold, dim, and eerily quiet. Miss Pamela Drury was gone. Her handbag remained behind the desk. A kettle sat on the counter, still half full of cold tea. But there was no note, no signs of departure, no explanation, and then they found the back door unlatched. By noon, word had reached every corner of the village. For the second time in less than a week, Netherdean stood at the edge of something it could neither explain nor ignore. Miss Marple received the news while tying back her sweet pea vines in the garden. Constable Druitt arrived breathless and pale, his boots damp from the fields. "Miss Marple, Pamela Drury, she's missing." She didn't move immediately. Instead, she looped the twine once more around the stake, then brushed her gloves free of soil. "When?" "This morning. The delivery boy said the door was open. Inspector Cray's there now." Miss Marple nodded. "I'll join him shortly." As the constable turned to go, she called after him. "Has anyone checked the churchyard?" He blinked. "No, why?" "Because Pamela liked to read there," she said, "and because some people when frightened seek silence. Others, they seek symbols of safety." Miss Marple arrived at the library to find Cray hunched beside the counter, flipping through Euphemia's correspondence box with a furrowed brow. "She's not the type to vanish," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Didn't own a car, never travelled far. No money to speak of, no family nearby." Miss Marple nodded, glancing around. And yet something made her go, or someone. Cray gestured to the mess. "Nothing stolen. Her purse was here, glasses too." "She wore them for reading," Miss Marple said, "but not always outside." Cray looked up. "You think she left willingly?" "I think someone frightened her enough to make her leave in haste, and I think it happened after she found something." She stepped around the counter and examined the stack of books Miss Drury had last been sorting. The golden dagger still sat near the top, dog-eared and slightly bent. Miss Marple lifted it carefully, noting that the back pages were missing, torn recently and deliberately. Cray's gaze narrowed. She removed them. Or someone did, possibly after she spoke to me. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Cray said, "I've already sent men to the woods. If she's not found by sundown," but he didn't finish. They found Pamela Drury just before the sun dipped behind the hedgerows. She was seated on a low bench in the churchyard, her coat wrapped tight despite the mild weather, and her eyes red-rimmed from weeping. In her hands she clutched a small, leather-bound notebook, Euphemia Bindle's journal. Inspector Cray took it from her gently. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "Why did you leave?" he asked. Pamela sniffled. "Because I knew they'd come looking for it. I didn't know who to trust." "Where did you find it?" "In the bottom of the donation box, hidden inside a hollowed-out book. Euphemia must have hidden it there before her death." Miss Marple stepped forward. "May I?" Cray handed the journal over. The cover was worn smooth, the corners cracked. Miss Marple opened it to the middle and read silently for a moment. "They all think I don't know, but I see it. The way Clara looked at the ledger, the way Evelyn trembled when she asked about the trust. Even Edna, sanctimonious Edna, knew more than she let on. But it's the letter that matters. It always has." Miss Marple flipped a few more pages. "If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident. There are too many truths buried in these pages, and at least one person willing to do anything to keep them there." She closed the journal softly. She knew. Cray exhaled. "We'll have it examined properly." Pamela finally spoke again. "She told me, in one of her letters, that the truth wasn't just about what happened. It was about why people hid it, and why they act when it resurfaces," Miss Marple added. Cray looked to her. "This changes things." "It does," Miss Marple said. "Now we know Euphemia feared someone. Enough to leave breadcrumbs. Enough to suspect she wouldn't live to see the book published." Cray frowned. "But the journal doesn't name the killer." "No," Miss Marple said, "because Euphemia believed her memoir would force the truth out." That evening, Miss Marple sat before her fire, journal open on her lap. The facts, now more visible, had begun to arrange themselves like lines in a ledger. Each name, each motive, each quiet omission. Evelyn Winton had written threats. Edna Cotterell had lied about the letter. Mrs. Gillibrooke had once been privy to the Wintons' affairs. But it was Pamela Drury, timid, gentle, overlooked Pamela, who had held the final key. Miss Marple tapped her finger gently against the spine of the journal. Euphemia had buried it for safekeeping, yes, but not just anywhere. She'd hidden it among the donated books, a subtle nod to Miss Drury. A person she trusted to find it eventually. A librarian who knew how to file away secrets until the time was right. And now the time had come. There had been 2 crimes in Netherdean, Miss Marple thought. One committed with poison, and another, longer ago, committed with silence, and both were about to be answered for. Chapter 8. It was just past tea time when Miss Marple made her invitation. Rounds. Polite, unassuming visits to each of the key individuals who had attended Euphemia Bindle's ill-fated salon. Her message was simple. She would be hosting a quiet gathering at her cottage the next day. No more than a friendly chat to reflect on recent events. She did not use the word murder. Nor did she mention the journal. But by noon the following day, her drawing-room was full. Basil Frame arrived first, looking pale and fidgety, followed by Miss Hartley, composed but watchful. Mrs. Gillibrooke brought lemon scones, perhaps as a peace offering, and Reverend Cotterell accompanied his sister, Edna, who wore her usual expression of faint irritation. Even Inspector Cray was present, seated discreetly in the corner with a notebook he didn't open. Miss Marple served the tea herself, I find, she said gently as she passed cups around. That conversation is often more revealing than interrogation, particularly when the subject is one everyone pretends not to think about. The room shifted uncomfortably. We are all here, of course, she continued, because Euphemia's death was not an act of fate, and because it stemmed from something long before her memoir was ever printed. Edna set her cup down too forcefully. Is this necessary, Miss Marple? Oh, quite, she replied pleasantly, because Euphemia understood something others didn't. That truth doesn't just expose facts, it exposes character. She turned to Miss Hartley. Did you know Euphemia had located the letter from Commander Wells? Miss Hartley stiffened. No. Curious, Miss Marple said. She mentioned it in her journal, and he confirmed she'd written to him. Of course, it was never published, nor shown, but perhaps someone thought it might be. Miss Hartley didn't respond. Which raises a question, Miss Marple went on, of why the mere suggestion of the letter's existence stirred such alarm. She turned her gaze to Basil. Or why Basil was so quick to accuse others, when, in truth, his own family name was already fading under the weight of Euphemia's revisionist history. He shifted in his seat. I never touched her tea. No, Miss Marple agreed, but you did have opportunity, if not motive. Her eyes slid to Mrs. Gillibrooke. And you, dear, you baked her favourite cake, lemon sponge. She didn't touch it, though. Odd, isn't it? Euphemia rarely let food go to waste. Mrs. Gillibrooke's lips tightened. She'd been upset that morning. Said she had a headache. Ah, said Miss Marple, but I wonder, had she seen something? Or perhaps someone handling the tray in her sitting room? Cray leaned forward slightly, sensing the shift in tone. Miss Marple didn't pause. You see, Euphemia left behind a journal, quite detailed, and in it she hinted that if anything happened to her, the key would lie not in who had reason to kill her, but in who feared what she'd write next. She rose from her chair and moved to the mantel, hands folded lightly. She even left us a passage to consider. Her voice remained soft, but every word rang clearly. A quote from her book. He disappeared into the night with the secret sealed in ink and regret. A beat of silence, then a single sharp inhale. Miss Marple turned. Mrs. Gillibrooke was no longer smiling. That quote, she said, her voice low. That wasn't in the reading. No, said Miss Marple calmly. It wasn't. The others looked between, them, confusion flickering, Cray's eyes narrowed. "You've just revealed," Miss Marple continued gently, "that you read a section of Euphemia's memoir she did not share aloud, one that was underlined, later found marked in a personal copy left in her sitting room." Mrs. Gillybrooke's teacup rattled as she set it down. "I might have browsed through it. She lent me a draft once." "No," Miss Marple said. "You saw the final manuscript, the published edition. The underlined section was in a copy found in her personal study, one no one else had reason to touch, unless they were there, recently, quietly. Silence again, the kind that settles just before a confession, or collapse." Mrs. Gillybrooke folded her hands in her lap. "She was going to ruin Clara's memory," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And Evelyn's she already had," Edna muttered. "She called Clara a thief," the widow continued. "Said she'd mismanaged a trust. But it wasn't theft. It was desperation. Evelyn told me. She only ever meant to borrow from the fund." Euphemia twisted it into a scandal. Miss Marple stepped forward. "So you protected them?" "She mocked me," Mrs. Gillybrooke whispered, "in front of everyone. Always so clever, so superior. And now she had a platform to spread poison. I didn't want Evelyn to suffer again. She's been through enough." Cray's voice was quiet but firm. "How did you do it?" "Slipped the digitalis into her upstairs tea," she said. "She always had a cup before her nap. I poured it while she was reading. She never saw me." Miss Hartley recoiled slightly. Basil stared into his cup. Miss Marple moved gently to sit beside Mrs. Gillybrooke. "I've always found," she said, "that people rarely commit murder for themselves. It's usually done for someone else, for love, for shame, for loyalty, but it never undoes the damage. It only deepens it." Mrs. Gillybrooke didn't respond. Cray stood slowly. "I'll need you to come with me." As the group rose in uneasy silence, Miss Marple remained seated, hands once again folded in her lap. She looked not at the door, but at the cold, untouched slice of lemon sponge still resting on the tea-tray. She had known, in truth, ever since Euphemia left it untouched, the smallest detail, overlooked by all but one. Chapter 9, The Confession, did not echo through the village in shouts or scandalous proclamations. It spread instead in hushed tones behind curtained windows, between carefully measured glances at the greengrocer's, and in pauses held a beat too long during polite conversation. Mrs. Gillybrooke, the ever-cheerful widow known for her scones and Sunday charity drives, had been quietly escorted from Miss Marple's cottage by Inspector Cray. She didn't protest. She didn't cry. She simply lowered her gaze and walked out into the dusk, as though the truth had already settled into her bones long before it reached her lips. But the case, as Miss Marple understood it, was not yet finished. For though the killer had been caught, the reason still required clarity, not for the constables, who would reduce it to motive and means, but for the hearts and minds of Netherdean. For the ones still whispering, still wondering, how did it come to this? And so the following afternoon, Miss Marple did what she rarely did. She requested a meeting at the vicarage, not as a guest, but as a speaker. "I think," she said gently to Reverend Cotterell, "a few villagers would appreciate a clearer sense of closure." He understood at once. They gathered in the vicar's drawing-room just after 3 o'clock. Not the entire village, of course. Just those who had been touched most directly by Euphemia Bindle's life and death. Edna Cotterill sat stiffly beside the fireplace, arms crossed. Miss Hartley brought her knitting, but never touched it. Roger Schulz. Frame stood by the window, avoiding everyone's eyes. Pamela Drury lingered near the sideboard, unusually still. And, of course, Inspector Cray, notebook again closed, but very much listening. Miss Marple stood, hands clasped neatly in front of her. There was no drama in her voice, only clarity. "I should begin by saying," she said, "that Mrs. Gillibrooke's confession is genuine. She administered the poison, and she acted with intent. But understanding what led her to do so is not merely a matter of crime. It is, I believe, a matter of human nature." The room remained silent. Euphemia Bindle was not beloved, but she was powerful. Not because she held influence, but because she understood people's truths, especially those they did not want seen. Her memoir was not a collection of stories. It was a quiet form, of vengeance, a settling of old accounts, many of which the subjects were unaware had even been opened. She looked toward Edna, whose eyes narrowed but said nothing. She claimed to tell the truth, but truth, as we all know, can be sharpened like a blade. Miss Marple continued. The journal Euphemia left behind makes it clear she expected retaliation. Not necessarily murder, but resistance. Her chapter on Clara Winton was thinly disguised. Those who knew Clara's story recognized it at once, and Evelyn Winton, still grieving her mother's reputation, had every reason to feel wronged. But Evelyn wasn't here. She turned her gaze to the rest. Mrs. Gillibrooke was, and she had remained silent for years about a truth that, if revealed, would have undone the quiet memory Clara Winton had left behind. "She did it out of loyalty?" Miss Hartley asked, her voice surprisingly sharp. "Not only," Miss Marple said. "She did it out of fear. Fear that Evelyn's name would be dragged into scandal again. Fear that an old betrayal, long buried, would be exhumed by a woman who considered revelation a public service." "And the tea?" Basil asked. She knew Euphemia kept a tray in her sitting room. While the reading continued, she excused herself for the washroom and quietly slipped upstairs. The digitalis was administered in a second teacup, not the one Euphemia held during the reading, but the one she always drank in private. It was measured precisely, masked by lemon and sugar. Euphemia never tasted the bitterness. Pamela Drury's voice was a whisper. She didn't want to kill a person. She wanted to kill a memory. Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, but that's the tragedy of it, because memory lives on regardless." There was a long silence. Then Edna spoke. "So, it's done then?" "Almost," Miss Marple replied. "But there is one more point I must address." She retrieved a small envelope from her handbag and set it on the table. This was found, tucked into the hollow of a false book. The letter from Commander Wells. Euphemia did recover it, but she chose not to publish it. Miss Hartley's eyes widened. She wanted the threat of it to act as leverage, but she never intended for it to see print. Her final journal entry makes that very clear. She feared the damage would be irreparable. Miss Marple turned to Edna. "That may be a small mercy, but it is one worth acknowledging." The envelope remained untouched. Inspector Cray, finally, stood. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I believe we have everything we need." Miss Marple gave a modest nod. "It's not always about solving the puzzle, Inspector. Sometimes it's about recognizing that all the pieces were never meant to fit together cleanly." Later that evening, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. The tea tray had been cleared, her fireplace gently crackling. Outside, the village was quiet, almost deceptively so. She sank into her armchair and stared for a long moment at her embroidery basket before setting it aside. Some truths, she thought, don't need stitching. They need silence. Not all crimes are about greed. Some are born of protection, shame, or love turned sideways. Euphemia had underestimated the cost of her own words, and Mrs. Gillibrooke had overestimated the power of secrecy. In the end, both had paid dearly, and Netherdean, like all villages touched by murder, would never quite be the same. Chapter 10. The following morning brought rain, a slow, unhurried drizzle that soaked the hedgerows and turned the village lanes into soft trails of mud. Miss Marple watched it from her window, her tea cooling on the side table beside her. The quiet was welcome. It gave space for reflection, and there was much to reflect upon. Inspector Cray arrived just before 10, coat damp, expression unreadable. I thought, he said after stepping inside and removing his hat. "You might indulge me. There are still gaps, small ones." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, gesturing to the chair opposite. "It's often the smallest gaps that matter." "Most," he sat, notebook in hand. "Let's begin with the torn letter Pamela found. You believed it was meant to be seen." "I did," she said. "Euphemia knew the danger of naming names, but she also knew the value of implication. That page was likely written to provoke fear, not a confession, but hesitation. She placed it inside the golden dagger precisely because the book's plot mirrored her own suspicions. A clever clue meant for someone to find. But the page was unsigned. "Deliberately," Miss Marple replied. "Had it been truly anonymous, it would have seemed harmless. But a single initial C was enough to rattle nerves. It implicated too many. Clara, Cotterell, even the fictional character in the memoir. Euphemia didn't point a finger. She dropped a stone in the water and waited for the ripples." Cray nodded slowly. "And the teacup. We know she drank upstairs, but what made you suspect it had been tampered with?" "A combination of things," Miss Marple said. "Her untouched cake, for one. Euphemia loved sweets. She rarely left her plate unfinished. But that day she had only the tea. More importantly, when I entered the room after the incident, I noticed a faint scent, bitter, underneath the usual lemon. Digitalis leaves a particular trace. You've smelled it before." "Once," she said, "in a very unfortunate case involving a rose garden and a particularly competitive jam competition." Cray didn't press further. "And the marked book in her study?" he asked. Miss Marple retrieved the volume from the shelf and opened it once again to the underlined passage. "He disappeared into the night with the secret sealed in ink and regret. She didn't underline it," she said. "Someone else did, likely the killer during a previous visit, perhaps even the day before. Euphemia was known to leave her things about. She wasn't secretive. She was confrontational. That quote must have struck a nerve. It mirrored the very act the killer feared. A secret about to be printed, its ink already dry." Cray scribbled something, then paused. And the false book, where the journal was hidden? A final insurance, Miss Marple said. Euphemia may have played at recklessness, but she was shrewder than most gave her credit for. She suspected someone might act before the memoir reached publication, so she placed her true thoughts in the one place few would check. Among her own donations, trusting Miss Drury would be the one to find it. She did, Cray muttered. Barely. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. Euphemia trusted systems, libraries, catalogues, even if she didn't trust people. Cray leaned back. And Mrs. Gillibrooke? She saw herself as a guardian, Miss Marple said, of memory, of dignity, of a family legacy that Euphemia. She didn't act out of hatred. She acted out of correction. Euphemia's version of events would tarnish Clara Winton's name, and by extension, Evelyn's future. To Mrs. Gillibrooke, that was unacceptable. Cray looked toward the window. The method was chillingly calm. She's a baker, Miss Marple said gently, accustomed to careful measurements. She chose a poison that mimicked heart failure, and used it in a place Euphemia felt safe. Her own sitting room, her private cup. There was no confrontation, just a final silent decision. Cray said nothing for a long moment. Then quietly he asked, "Do you believe she regrets it?" Miss Marple considered. "Yes, but not in the way you or I might think. I believe she regrets being caught. I believe she regrets the disruption. But the act? No, she convinced herself it was protection." Cray stood and tucked his notebook away. "I should be getting back." She walked him to the door. As he turned to leave, he hesitated. "One last thing. You've solved more of these than anyone I know. Does it ever get easier?" "No," she said softly, "but it does become clearer." After he left, Miss Marple returned to her chair. The rain had slowed to a fine mist, and the village lay hushed beneath grey clouds. From the window she could see Reverend Cotterell tending to the church garden, trimming dead stalks with quiet diligence. Edna stood beside him, offering clipped advice as always. Life resumed. It always did, but beneath that surface scars remained. Euphemia Bindle had died not because of who she was, but because of what she knew, or rather, what she threatened to make known. And Mrs. Gillibrooke had killed not to silence a person, but to preserve a version of the past that could no longer survive scrutiny. Neither woman had anticipated the cost. Miss Marple reached for her embroidery again, the thread curling through her fingers like a thought waiting to take shape. Every knot, every loop, every pattern, it all required tension to hold. And in Netherdean, it had taken just the right pull to unravel it all. Chapter 11. Justice in Nether. Dean arrived not with a clang of handcuffs or a courtroom scene, but with quiet paperwork and subdued police visits. Mrs. Gillibrooke did not resist. She offered no further statements beyond her confession in Miss Marple's parlour, and no names beyond the one that had already haunted the village, Euphemia Bindle. Inspector Cray escorted her out of the village himself, the constables instructed to keep their uniforms discreet, their voices low. The goal was not spectacle. It was containment. But in a place like Netherdean, where every hedge had ears and every window hosted a curtain drawn just an inch too far, The aftermath was impossible to hide. At the post office, Mr. Sims adjusted the mail slots in silence. He no longer made small talk with customers. At the bakery, 2 women returned their usual orders but whispered about how lemon sponge had lost its charm. At the library, Pamela Drury resumed her duties, though she had taken to shelving with a quiet, haunted precision, as if every book might contain a confession she had missed. It was Basil Frame who perhaps took it hardest. For all his protestations and bluster, he had truly admired Euphemia, loathed her methods, yes, but respected her courage. He vanished from the village a week later without a word, his small rented flat left bare, save for a single half-burned manuscript in the hearth. And Edna Cotterill, though outwardly unchanged, began declining invitations. Her opinions, once unrelentingly offered at every gathering, became occasional nods. Her brother, Reverend Cotterill, delivered gentler sermons, ones with fewer verses about righteousness and more about mercy. Miss Marple noticed these changes, catalogued them as she did with bird migrations and the first frost of the season. They were small, quiet shifts in the ecosystem of village life, natural, inevitable, but not painless. One overcast afternoon, Pamela stopped by Miss Marple's cottage with a wrapped parcel. "It's Euphemia's final draft," she said, placing it gently on the table, "the full memoir. The publisher sent it to the library, asked if we wanted it shelved or returned. Thought you ought to see it first." Miss Marple undid the twine slowly. The manuscript was thick, the type uneven. Marginalia filled nearly every page, some cross-outs, others underlined, a few small notes in Euphemia's unmistakably sharp hand. No names, only truths. Too cruel or simply accurate? "This one stays. Let them guess." Miss Marple read through a few passages silently, then closed the bundle and looked up at Pamela. "It should be returned," she said softly. Pamela blinked. "Not archived? Wanted her voice heard? Yes, but this manuscript, it's not a record, it's a blade. And there are already too many wounds in this village." Pamela nodded, eyes glassy. "It's strange. I thought I admired her. I did. But now I wonder if I ever really knew her at all." Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "Admiration and understanding don't always walk hand in hand." Pamela left, shortly after promising to deliver the parcel back to the publisher. As she walked away down the lane, Miss Marple watched her go with something close to affection. She'd changed, grown more cautious perhaps, but also more aware. Awareness was the gentler cousin of wisdom. It often came at a price. The following Sunday, the church pews were quieter than usual. Reverend Cotterill gave a sermon on grace, his words unadorned, his gaze steady. Afterward, villagers filtered out slowly, reluctant to speak too quickly, as if fearing what might be overheard, or what might be remembered. Miss Marple stood little longer than most, admiring the stained glass near the altar, not for its beauty, but for the way the light distorted as it passed through. It reminded her of truth, how it bent depending on where one stood. Edna Cotterill approached her as she was leaving. "I suppose you think me weak," she said suddenly, voice low. Miss Marple tilted her head. "No, I think you were frightened." Edna looked down. "She nearly ruined us all, Jane, Clara, Evelyn, even Basil." "She ruined nothing," Miss Marple said. She merely revealed what was already crumbling. Euphemia didn't cause the fracture. She pressed a finger to the crack. Edna's jaw trembled. You always were better at seeing things. Miss Marple didn't answer that. Instead, she said, You still have time to mend some of it, but only if you speak gently. Not for others, for yourself. Edna gave a short nod and walked away. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her hands resting quietly in her lap. No embroidery, no book, just silence and thought. She considered Euphemia again, a woman who had once insisted, over tea at the Women's Guild, that fiction was far too timid, that real life offered sharper daggers and deeper betrayals than any penned plot. And yet, in the end, Euphemia had fallen to a story of her own making and had courted truth recklessly, forgetting that some truths were not dead things. Some were alive, pulsing with old pain, capable of lashing back. Mrs. Gillibrooke had not poisoned her over lies, but over memory, over the fear that something long buried would rise and cast new shadows on the living. In that sense, Miss Marple thought, justice had been done. But no justice could unmake the fear, or restore trust to a village now more cautious with its glances, more restrained in its gossip. No justice could unwrite the final sentence Euphemia had marked in her journal. The past is not a graveyard, it's a garden, and every secret left unattended finds a way to grow. Miss Marple looked out at the rose bushes in her front garden. One, she noticed, had bloomed unexpectedly early. She would trim it tomorrow. For now, she let it grow. Chapter 12. The letter arrived a week later, in an envelope so nondescript it nearly ended up in Miss Marple's stack of seed catalogues. It bore no return address, but the handwriting, elegant, controlled, a little too careful, was unmistakably not English. She recognized the fluid loops of an overseas hand, one shaped by years of diplomatic reports or naval correspondence. It was postmarked from Gibraltar. Miss Marple set down her breakfast toast and opened the envelope with a letter knife polished to near extinction. Inside was a single sheet of cream paper, the header marked with a crest, Royal Navy. My dear Miss Marple, I've only just received word from Inspector Cray regarding the unfortunate events in Netherdean. I must admit I am both saddened and unsurprised. Euphemia Bindle was never one to tread lightly where reputations were concerned. To the matter of the letter, yes, I confirm I did write it in 1901, shortly before my departure from Hong Kong. It was intended for Miss Hartley, to explain certain financial arrangements I made on behalf of Clara Winton. Euphemia must have come across a copy during her research, or more likely, persuaded someone to share it with her. Either way, it was not intended for public eyes, and I had long believed it lost to the sea. The original contained nothing illegal, but enough suggestion of impropriety that, if misinterpreted, it would certainly cast shadows over Clara's final years. I thank you, sincerely, for ensuring it remained. As for Mrs. Gillibrooke, I remember her well. She once made me a gooseberry tart during a summer visit in 1920. A gentle woman. It is strange, isn't it, what people are capable of under the weight of memory. Should you ever find yourself in Gibraltar, I hope you will allow me to return the favour, with tea and something less tragic than gossip. Yours most sincerely, Commander E. J. Wells, Miss Marple read the letter twice, the first time for information, the second for tone. There was no bitterness in Commander Wells' words, only resignation, and a touch of wistful understanding. Euphemia, in the end, had not been wrong in her suspicions. But the truth she threatened to unleash was not a crime. It was a wound, one which time had only half healed. The letter, she knew, would remain unread by the villagers. She placed it gently in her writing desk, beneath a stack of old recipe cards and birthday notes from nieces long grown. It wasn't proof for the law. It was confirmation for the soul. Later that day, Miss Marple paid one final visit to the library. Pamela Drury was rearranging the local history shelf again, though this time she smiled when Miss Marple entered. "I suppose you've come for the journal?" she asked. "No, dear," Miss Marple said. "I came to give you something," handed Pamela a small envelope, unsealed. Inside was a single page, copied from the letter she'd received. Commander Wells's admission that the past Euphemia hinted at was real, but undeserving of scandal. Pamela read it silently. Her fingers trembled as she finished. "You're sure?" she whispered. Miss Marple nodded. "The original will remain locked away. But this should be enough to silence any doubts, for those who still need peace." Pamela exhaled. "Do you think she would have published it anyway, Euphemia?" Miss Marple smiled softly. "No, she loved the game too much to ever tip the board entirely. She wielded truth like a match, just enough to threaten fire, rarely enough to burn." Pamela stared at the letter a moment longer, then carefully folded it and slipped it between the pages of Tales from a Silk Fan, placing the book back on its shelf. But what if someone finds it? "They'll find a story," Miss Marple said, "one with an ending." That evening, the village exhaled. There was no announcement, no service, no statue erected in Euphemia's name. But the gossip softened. The silence around Mrs. Gillibrooke's cottage began to loosen, neighbours leaving parcels by the gate again. Even Reverend Cotterell, that Sunday, spoke of compassion without once invoking judgment. Miss Marple sat in her garden, the scent of early lavender drifting through the air. The red-breasted robin returned to its usual perch near the window. The eiderche rosebush that had bloomed too early now held petals browning at the edges. The seasons, she thought, had turned. End of chapter 12.